In a great kingdom, there was a boy who wanted to learn more than he had ever wanted anything. Every morning he passed the village school and looked through the doorway with hungry, eager eyes. The teacher took one look at his torn clothes and bare feet and pointed at the door without a word. He walked to the second school in the village and stood at its entrance with the same eagerness. The second teacher looked him up and down and shook his head and closed the heavy door. He climbed the stone steps of the grandest school in the village and stood before its senior scholar. The scholar looked down at him from the top of the steps with cold, distant eyes and said nothing. Then he turned and went inside, and the grand door closed above the poor boy's head. 3 schools and 3 closed doors, and the boy stood in the street and did not cry once. He walked to the edge of the village and sat under an ancient tree and picked up a sharp pebble. He found a flat, smooth stone and began scratching letters and numbers into its surface carefully. He had watched enough through doorways and listened enough through walls to have a place to start. Every evening after his work, he sat under that tree and taught himself everything he could reach. He listened through school walls and remembered every word and worked through every problem alone. He scratched calculations onto flat stones and checked his answers and started again when they were wrong. Seasons passed and the flat stones under his tree multiplied and his knowledge grew without anyone helping. Then one morning a royal herald rode through the village reading an announcement from an official scroll. The king would hold a great examination and question the finest minds in the kingdom personally. The school teachers immediately began selecting their best students with proud and ambitious expressions. The poor boy stood at the edge of the crowd and listened, and then turned toward the palace road. When he asked the school teacher about the examination, the teacher laughed until his eyes watered. He pointed at the boy's bare feet and torn clothes and told him to go back to his stones. The boy looked at the teacher for a moment and then turned and walked toward the palace road. The palace guards looked at his torn clothes and bare feet and blocked his path immediately. The boy pointed calmly to the royal herald's announcement on the palace notice board beside the gate. The guard read the notice and looked back at the boy and stepped aside with a reluctant expression. Inside the grand examination hall, every candidate wore fine clothes and sat at carved wooden desks. The boy walked in, and every head in the room turned, and every face showed the same expression. He walked to the last empty seat at the back of the hall and sat down and looked at his parchment. The royal examiner announced the questions, and the hall filled with the sound of urgent scratching quills. The boy wrote steadily and carefully, as if the questions were not new to him but familiar old friends. He did not rush, and he did not hesitate, and he finished before most of the other candidates. When the examiner collected his parchment, he glanced at it and then stopped and looked again. He read the first answer and then the second, and his routine expression disappeared completely. He stood reading the poor boy's parchment in the middle of the hall while everyone watched him. He looked up at the boy, and the boy looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment. That evening, the examiner brought the results to the king in the grand throne room. He presented one parchment first before all the others and pointed to it with a serious expression. The king read it, and his eyebrows rose and his back straightened, and he read it again. He looked up at the examiner and asked one question, and the examiner pointed toward the examination hall. The throne room doors opened, and the poor boy walked in with the examiner beside him. He looked at the king on his throne, and the king looked at him, and neither looked away. The king held up the examination parchment and asked the boy how he had answered what scholars had not. The boy told him simply, he had listened through school walls and scratched problems onto flat stones alone. He said no one had ever taught him anything, so he had taught himself everything he could find. The throne room was completely silent after those words, and not one advisor moved or spoke. The king looked at the boy for a long time, and something changed in his expression as he did. He stood up from his throne and stepped down and walked across the floor toward the poor boy. He asked the boy what he would do if given access to every book in the royal library. The boy's sharp, curious eyes lit with something that had no name but everyone in the room could see. He said he would read everything, and then he would find the questions that no book had answered yet. The king looked at the boy for another long moment, and then he did something nobody expected. He turned and told a palace servant to open the royal library and light every candle inside. He turned back to the boy and said, "From this day you have access to every book and scroll in that library." The boy was led through the palace corridors to the great library doors, and they opened before him. He stood in the doorway and looked at the towering shelves stretching from floor to ceiling in every direction. His hand reached out and touched the spine of the nearest ancient book with one careful finger. The king stood beside him, watching his face, and saw something that no amount of gold could produce. 3 schools had closed their doors, and none of them had understood what they were closing the door on. And the boy who had taught himself on flat stones under an ancient tree had just walked into everything.